Hi, my name is Michael Chikeen. The smartest people I've met have one common belief, that us silly humans really don't know much. For example, we still don't know why planes stay in the air, or how Tylenol or even gravity works. Yeah, gravity. Look it up. In today's distracted, clickbait, misinformation age, I wish we could all be less certain, more humble, and a lot more curious. Admittedly, I've been known to struggle with all three. So no more, no less, this show is my attempt to be that change. Thanks for joining me, and here we go. Hey everybody, welcome back to No More, No Less. I'm Michael Chikeen, and today I'm with Mojtaba Akhavan-Tafti. Mojtaba is the founder of APT Solar Solutions, whose mission it is to unlock the power of the sun by revolutionizing solar electricity generation and distribution. Mojtaba is also a space scientist, inventor, and part of the research faculty at the University of Michigan College of Engineering. There, he investigates the inner workings of the sun, the Earth, and if that's not enough, he teaches satellite mission design and analysis. And that last one seems like a fake job title from The Simpsons to me. But the reason I reached out to Mojtaba is because a couple of months ago, solar flares were in the news again. And it was something I became a little obsessed over about 10 years ago, to the point that I try not to think about it now because they kind of freak me out. So in an effort to expand how I think about the world, I wanted to interview someone who I could dive into this with and hopefully unlock the larger theme of solar power and renewables. So Mojtaba, welcome to the show.
Thank you so very much, Michael, for having me.
I guess let's start with, how did you get into a field like power generation, solar? Like, how did you go from, like we've said before we started recording, growing up in Iran to I'm gonna solve the renewable crisis?
Yeah, I wouldn't say I'm solving any big problems, but the way it all started is so I'm actually a space scientist, as you mentioned. And so that started from my days in college. When I was a junior in college, I had an internship here at the University of Michigan for the summer, where I actually did a project on planet Mercury, using data from a mission called Messenger. It's a NASA mission that eventually ended by the satellite running into the planet, and that's normally how planetary missions go.
Really?
But it provided significant amount of data that we allowed us to learn so much about planet Mercury, because in so many ways it sounds counterintuitive, but planet Mercury looks very much like our planet
Okay.
in that it is a magnetic body. So there's an intrinsic magnetic field inside the planet, and the way it interacts with the sun is very similar to the ways that Earth interacts with the sun.
Hmm.
So I did that project, and then later, as soon as I had the opportunity to apply for the grad school at the University of Michigan, I did, and luckily I got in. And so I started my grad school in 2015, and that's where my journey to the sun began.
Okay. Yeah, it seems like such a zoom out position for some people studying like social psychology, of which, I'm also a fan of that field, but then going so far out to be like, how does our species and what we inhabit, is there anything out there that seems to replicate what we're doing enough for us to maybe learn something about, our relation to the planetary bodies? And how did you come? Because I'd like to, as quickly as possible, dive into the solar flare situation, because I guess so. I was reading, it was probably the Atlantic or some online article, and it was about how solar flares happen fairly often. And after I'm done this explanation, you could tell me how wrong my memory is, but that they happen every so often, and it's not a peculiar thing. However, if a really big one were to happen, which is not unlikely, then depending what part of Earth it hits, it could just wipe out all of the electricity that we have on that part of the planet, if not all of it. And so I read that. I remember putting the magazine down and just thinking, like, just how fragile our sovereignty and our life here is on our earth. Like you and I are having this conversation. I'm in Spain, you're in the US, and it's no problem. We think of it easily. But I went to bed, I remember that night, and I couldn't sleep because it was like it was in Canada, how the Canadian winters are. And it was freezing, it was snowing outside, and I'm like, what would happen if we had a solar flare tonight? And then I ran through like a zombie apocalypse scenario in my mind, and the next day I was like, no more solar flare come. So I'd love for you to expand or tell me where I was wrong for like how impressive and also how dangerous these solar flares are if they reach us.
Yeah, so it's interesting that you start with the significant dangers of solar flares.
Right to
So
apocalypse.
yeah,
Yeah.
so the way I normally start is the other way around. So being from Canada, you probably have seen Northern Lights.
No, I still haven't.
Oh, you haven't? Okay, I have traveled all around the world chasing Northern Lights,
Cool.
and Canada is just such a great place to see them because in northern climates where the magnetic fields, when you look at the planet Earth, the magnetic fields we have a magnetic pole. Magnetic fields come out of the southern part of the planet and go in on the north side, right?
Okay.
So the reason I'm talking about that is that when we have a strong solar activity, and the way the sun works is that every 11 years we have a solar cycle. 11 years the sun is rather quiet. We call that solar minimum. Another 11 years, it's we call it solar max. Solar activity is high.
Okay.
So every 22 years you expect to have similar behavior ish. So when the sun is active, there are a lot of magnetic fields on the sun and a lot of charged particles. And the reason there are a lot of charged particles on the sun is that sun is just a massive nuclear fission reaction, right? So all of these very heavy ions or heavy molecules, atoms like iron and oxygen and so on, are constantly breaking down into hydrogen and helium, right? So that's how the sun is a nuclear reactor. But so during that process, there's a lot of energy that is being produced. But the sun is also very hot, and this constant motion of the very hot material to the surface of the sun causes this very strong magnetic field. And the other aspect of that is that because the sun is so hot, all of the atoms that I just talked about are losing all of their electrons because it's just so hot. Just like when you look at um, a neon lamp, what you're seeing is that because of a very strong electric field inside this neon lamp, the gas inside is
Okay.
ionizing, meaning that the electrons are separating from the atom and then or nucleus, and when they return together, they get excited and generate light, right? So the same thing happens on the sun too. So we have oxygen that instead of if you've ever studied chemistry, you are normally used to O2 minus, which is gaining electrons. Whereas on the surface of the sun, because it's so hot, oxygen is 8 plus, meaning that all of its electrons have been um, ripped away from it because it's just the electrons are so excited that they cannot stay with the nucleus. So that is the content in the solar atmosphere. So very strong magnetic fields, and they contain these just strong um, concentration of charged particles that we call
Okay.
plasma. So a good example of plasma on Earth is fire,
Okay.
right? So it's simply when you have electrons and ions separated, so you don't have a neutral particle. You call that the gas. It's a gaseous kind of state. We call that plasma. And 99% of the universe is made out of plasma, not neutral atoms like
Oh,
air.
I did not know that.
Yeah. So we have the sun now. these magnetic fields constantly moving around, and once in a while we have both closed magnetic fields. That means that from one end the magnetic field comes back to the sun and
Mm-hmm.
closes. We also have field lines that are go all the way out to the end of what we call heliosphere, which is pretty much how far this magnetic fields from the sun can propagate.
So that's if there's a flare during the maximum of that 10 or 11 year cycle, it would go to the maximum radius of that heliosphere.
So the way it works is that we're still trying to understand exactly how the cycle comes
Right.
about. There's a whole process called dynamo theory that indicates how this hot material is coming up to the surface of the sun. But what you need to know is that these magnetic fields, open and closed, once in a while start to come. So some of the field lines are facing north, some of them are facing
Okay.
south. And as soon as you have a north and south facing coming in contact, that's when we have a just like when you connect two batteries, plus and minus, all of a sudden you get this
Yeah.
arc. The same thing happens for magnetic fields too, is that there's a process called magnetic reconnection. And reconnection is where two oppositely facing field lines all of a sudden start to reconnect and rearrange the field lines such that now this field becomes this and this, right? So that the, the field line remains still open and closed. And during that process is when you have this all of these charged particles that I told you are along these magnetic
Okay.
fields. So as soon as that reconnection occurs, all of a sudden, all of this plasma or charged particle is going to just eject from the sun.
Okay.
And that is the process we call coronal mass ejection. So it's just a mass that is being ejected from the sun or from the solar corona,
Right. And so
which
that
is,
ejection presents as a flare.
so
Because it
that's only one of the
Okay. Because I
active
think we're going to need to
mechanisms
use
from it.
more analogies here. Because like pretend that you're speaking to a golden retriever on this. Because as far as I
Yes.
understand
Yeah.
space science, I do my best to read it as I find it fascinating. But like
Yeah.
once we get too far into like particles and eons and ions, I could sit here, focus as much as I can, and I'm not going to get it.
Okay.
I wish
Perfect. Yeah,
I
no.
wish I would. But so you said so. The flare is just one type of ejection.
So that's coronal mass ejection is one type
Okay.
of ejection. And sometimes this, so think of it as the sun
Right.
sneezing. It's
Excellent.
just, a bunch of
Yeah.
a bunch of particles are
Yeah.
coming out all
Right.
at once. So that bundle, forget about that now. But so sometimes during that process, these field lines that have these charged particles are now, some of that plasma is going outward, some of it is coming back toward the sun.
Okay.
The stuff that is coming back toward the sun is what causes the acceleration, or it heats up the plasma and accelerates some of the
Hmm.
plasma very much to the point where they're so hot that they start to emit in X-ray or soft X-ray, and that's flare.
Right.
So because flare is just light radiation, we see it within 8 seconds,
Okay.
because that's how long it takes for the light to travel from the
Right.
sun to
And there's
Earth.
no way for us to
And
know
that's what,
that it's coming.
but unfortunately, right now, no,
Right.
because the only thing we know right now is that solar flares are associated with these dark spots on the sun. So if you just looked at the sun, if you had a filter, and you would be able to
Right.
directly look at it, or simply just have a reflection of it on a piece of paper, sometimes you see these dark
Okay.
spots on the sun. And those dark spots is what we call active regions.
Hmm.
Active regions are where magnetic field is strongest.
Okay.
So earlier I talked about solar cycle, right? So every 11 years, the number of these active regions is very small on the sun. Another 11 years, we have many large active regions, so many dark spots on the
Right. And
sun.
has there ever been a time in recorded history where one of these flares or ejections has affected Earth, or maybe something in Like there's an event documented somewhere that thinks, maybe this could have been something.
Yes, so we actually have solar flares quite
Okay.
often. So during solar minimum, those 11 years, um, solar flares happen almost 2,000 times during that
Okay.
cycle, but they're not very
Right.
strong. You see them, they're not really impactful. The other 11 years, which right now we're almost at the very maximum,
Excellent.
in the middle of
Yeah.
2025, is going to be at the very um, peak of that solar
Okay.
cycle, which means that there are a lot of active regions on the sun right now. So just 2 months ago, there was one of the strongest solar flares we had seen over the past 20 years in May. And that's the article that you're
Right.
referring to. So we had the M class, X class solar flare taking place on the sun. And with that, there was that solar or coronal mass
Yeah.
ejection. So that all of that charged particle also came outward with that solar flare. So we saw within 8 seconds that there was a giant solar flare. And luckily, because solar flare is just light and it's very high energy, meaning that it's X-ray, as soon as it reaches the day side of our planet, the atmosphere just absorbs that light.
Okay.
So there are consequences with that I'll get back to. But in terms of like us on the surface of the sun, we don't have to worry about the flare
Okay.
itself impacting the radiation
Right.
impacting us. However, there are two things now. One is, so the atmosphere, the day side, just absorbed all of that X-ray. What
Hmm.
happens? So when you in the lab or anywhere else, you um, shine X-ray on any neutral particles, they absorb it, and that's when they start to break down into ions and electrons, so charged particles. So neutral particle becomes charged particle, which means that when you have so much of it, now you have electric
Right.
current. And we use the top layer of the atmosphere, we call it the ionosphere, because once you have the air, you go above that, there's a lot of sunshine that is being absorbed, and that's breaking down the atoms into electrons and
Okay.
ions. And we have a whole current system, that there's a whole sphere around our planet that is conductive. And that's how back in the day, for the first time when we started our communication platform, that we no longer were communicating via wire, the way it worked is that we would send radio waves to that layer, we call it the D
Hmm.
layer, and that would get reflected because it's a conductor. It gets reflected where you want it. And that's how we communicate across the ocean.
What?
Yeah.
Wow. I mean,
So
I'm
that's
dumber than
how
I thought. I
communication.
didn't know that at all. That's amazing. Okay.
Yeah, yeah, and that was the birth of AT&T back in the day.
Right. What year? And
It
what
was
year was
simply,
that?
we were talking about, um, if I understand correctly, mid 1900s.
The mid 19. Yeah, because those little parts in history have just accelerated human communication and what we're able to do so much. And it seems like the more we can speed up information exchange, the more we can learn and innovate and hopefully save ourselves from what seems like inevitable demise for what we're doing to the planet. But it seemed,
Yeah,
but I suppose so. At what point would a flare be able to disrupt all the electronics that we are so addicted to on this planet right now, both in
exactly.
necessity and through communication?
Yeah. So when I mentioned that solar flare is being absorbed by the top layer, what that means now is that if the solar flare is very strong, that layer is going to get very
Okay.
dense. That means a lot of air is breaking down and creating this very strong electric field or electric current on that sphere. So that means that all of these communication signals that we're sending out are going to get absorbed by that layer instead of getting reflected. So that's how solar flares are associated with radio blackouts.
Uh,
So we lose communication. There are times that we have lost communication altogether.
that's happened?
Yes, we have had
But
that
so
happen, and we have blackouts all the time too. And so GPS satellites are impacted by it too, because simply when the way you operate is that the communication signals get absorbed by these charged particles instead of propagating through just neutral
okay,
air.
because I thought there was a destruction of either satellites or just the mechanism in which those technologies worked. But it seems, if I'm understanding correctly, because the ionosphere is so charged and no longer able to reflect, that is what causes the blackout. And how long does that last?
Yeah, so typically, well, it depends on if it impacts the satellites also or not.
Okay.
So let me quickly tell you what are some of the other consequences and answer this question after. So you have now potential communication getting interrupted by the flare itself. The other thing that happens is that now, around 8 days later, that giant bundle of charged particles and magnetic fields is coming also towards you. And if you're lucky, it's going to hit Earth.
Okay.
So when that happens, that is when it just saturates and overwhelms our magnetic shield, which, the magnetic field that we have around Earth is constantly getting bombarded by the materials coming from
Hmm.
the sun. And normally it just, we just see very beautiful northern lights, because all of these charged particles, they can come directly at the planet, they only can travel along those field lines. And that's why in northern and south poles, that's where normally you see northern lights, because those are charged particles that are hitting the atmosphere. So if that bundle is very powerful, then that can overwhelm our magnetic shield and shrink it. And that's when all of a sudden you have that sphere that I told you about. There's a lot of electric current
Hmm.
buildup during that process. And that's when you have your entire electric grid, which, if you've ever um, charged your phone via this contact
Yeah.
charger, the way it works is that you have a magnetic field that is created by one um, you know ring, and there's another ring in your phone that the magnetic field is impacting this ring, and that's how it charges, right? So this current is contactless and causes electric current in the other
Right.
ring, right? So analogous to that ring is the entire electric grid on the surface of our planet, which electric current is always going and making these light bulbs turn on. But now, if that change in magnetic field or changing electric current because of that storm, we call it geomagnetic storm, is so strong, it overcharges the electric grid such that our transformers start to fail, because the electric lines get so hot, there's a lot of current and everything breaks down.
Right.
So not only now you have lost communication, but also your pipelines, oil pipelines, which are also a great conductor and looks like a ring, and they're all connected. Your electric grid, and in addition to that, there because the air is getting thicker, or the drag is getting higher for
Right.
satellites, they can also lose momentum in space. That's when astronauts are also exposed to very high
Radiation.
radiation
Right.
dose because of those two
So,
charged
so you're,
particles. So it's just
so you're saying we
multifaceted.
can't
So
communicate,
it's
and then do the transformers actually break, or there's something that, because of the magnetic field, they're no longer able to function and charge? Because
no, they break down.
right. So if that were to happen, so let's say tomorrow there's a gigantic solar flare, everything goes out, only you and like 1,000 people on the planet know what the fuck has just happened. What is the timeline to get the world back on? Well, I guess figuratively and literally back online.
Yeah. So for the so one of the things that the field is, and NASA and NOAA are heavily invested in, and other space agencies around the world are invested in, is the prediction capability. Because again, as I mentioned, right now, sometimes these active regions generate solar flares, sometimes they
Right.
don't. So you can't go to communication satellites and say, turn off your communication satellites, because a solar flare is going to come out and nothing
Right.
happens. You become, you know, the boy who cried wolf. Because what we're trying to do is to make our prediction capability very accurate, such that when NASA or NOAA warns you that, hey, your satellites are at risk, or your electric grid is at risk, that you listen.
Right.
Sadly, it was 2 3 years ago when the Starlink satellites from
Yeah.
SpaceX were launched. There was not even a strong storm, but there was a medium scale geomagnetic storm that was happening. SpaceX, if as much as I understand, was informed about this storm. They ignored it, and they
Classic.
they lost 40 satellites to that mild storm, because the air got so thick that the drag got increased very much, and the satellites, instead of staying in that orbit, because of high, a lot of air pushing against the satellite, they deorbited. They reduced in altitude and eventually burned in the atmosphere.
Right. So they could have
So
saved 40 satellites, but instead they just ignored it. Like, which kind of speaks to how that company's run on some level. So you're trying to have better predictive capability, not just for geostorms, but also for these larger flares that right now are almost completely unpredictable. Okay.
Correct. So much of it is still unpredictable, and for example, at the University of Michigan, we have these global simulations that we're constantly trying to improve to make it, more reliable, so that if you see certain formation of active regions, you know that it's going to be associated with solar flares and potentially coronal mass ejections, and therefore predict, one, if that so solar flare, if it happens on the side of the sun that you're facing, it's going to come directly at you, because it's light and it's quick and it's
Right.
going to hit you.
But if we're if
The
we're on
coronal
if we
mass
happen to be on
ejection,
the other side of the planet when that happens, we're safe.
safe against solar flare.
Yeah. So it's just luck.
So
It's like a
there's
roulette wheel. It depends that we hope
yes,
someone else's number comes up when that flare happens, right? Okay.
yes, yeah, and it happens quite often. Again, it's simply just a matter of where you are. But the coronal mass ejection, on the other hand, those don't propagate directly at you. They go along these little ballerina shaped field lines, because you know those materials propagate just like if you have a hose in your hand and you turn, the water doesn't go straight out. It starts to look like a
Bit of a
little
spiral.
spiral.
Okay.
Yeah. So when the sun sneezes, the material is going to go like this. So it could be that if you just didn't see that flare on the surface of the sun, that the actual material may still get to you,
Right.
or that if you saw the flare, that the coronal mass ejection is going to miss you,
Right.
because you're just outside of its
Okay.
orbit.
Well, let's
So
let's get back to the apocalypse though. If
yes.
Ontario Power Generation has zero transformers that are working, we cannot turn
Mhm.
anything that we're using right now into energy. How long does it take for us to, I guess, even turn the electricity back on? And like, never mind the communication
Mhm.
stations. Like, how long are we down for?
Yeah. So the biggest storm that we're aware of is called the Carrington event, and that's in 1859, I
Right.
believe.
Well, wait, hold on. I
Back
want to hear about
then,
that, but let's go to what hasn't happened yet. Let's really turn on the doom. But so tell me, you said 1859 is the last time you guys have anything recorded that is a solar flare.
so we didn't have any of the fancy instruments that we have
Okay.
today. All we know about that storm is that it was so strong that the the impact of the sun and that coronal mass ejection that impacted Earth can be detected inside tree rings
Holy
decades
shit.
later, because of the way it impacted Earth. So during that time, there was not much
Yeah.
electricity, but the blackout was significant. It came all the way down to the equator. It was so strong.
Wh-
So just 2 months ago, we had a storm that you could see the northern lights all the way down to Michigan or even down to Alabama,
Wow.
which is 20 degrees farther south. And that simply shows the impact of what a strong storm can do. So now, in terms of how long does it take for you to recover from it, so if you have prepared for it, you actually can switch off the transformers so that they're not engaged when the overcurrent happens. But in case you didn't, then it takes as long as needed to replace all of the failed transformers if the lines are okay, because sometimes the lines can itself get so hot that they can simply just
Oh my
burn out,
gosh.
because in some ways your electric wire can act like a resistor inside your heater. It gets so hot that it starts to just get red and then break down.
Right. And we're trying to repair all of
So
these things without power.
correct, correct.
Right. So we're talking like
So
6 months?
that's it could be very long. It depends on the how densely populated that the region is, how complex the electric grid is. If you're out in the woods, there's only one field line coming. If you're close to a power generator, maybe you're not as badly impacted. But if you're in densely populated New York
Right.
City, where lines are going everywhere
Right. It's
and
going to be
there's so many transformers,
chaos,
substations.
pandemonium. Okay.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
in a scenario like that, does switching the energy usage in any country to renewables like solar, wind, etc., does that solve for this, or does it knock out, or would a solar flare kind of knock out the transformers in a wind turbine, for example?
Yeah. So one of the reasons that renewable is attractive is that renewable energy is what we call a localized um, power generator, meaning that instead of having one giant dam where it generates, or a power station, gas power generator, or nuclear event, you have all of the field lines going out from that central power
Yeah.
station to cities and elsewhere. Whereas when it comes to wind and solar, they can come closer because they don't have any pollution associated
Hmm.
with them. You can bring them closer to the cities or urban areas so that electricity doesn't have to travel so long
Right.
to get to you. So that's one of the benefits, and that can in some ways mitigate some of that challenge associated with those big storms. On the other hand, if the electric grid itself has failed because of the failure of the substation, then you cannot access that power anyway.
Okay.
But one of the benefits is that when you bring it closer, that means that that ring that I told you about that is causing this giant electric current to form, you're making it smaller and smaller by making things more localized.
Right. So if I have a home
So
that is, let's say, half an hour outside of Barcelona in not a so populated area, I have solar panels on my house that is bringing everything, all the power that's sufficient for me to run my house every day, year round. Am I immune to a flare that wipes out everything else, or is there still like a problem? Because there's still, unless you have a strong water filter, like I don't know if those things would also fail.
no, it actually, if you have your own solar panels and that's sufficient to run your house, then you're safe because you're not connected to the
Right.
grid. If you're off grid, the grid breakdown is not going to
So
impact you.
just make sure you have all
It's
of your
just like if
series and
you
movies downloaded. Uh, train a series of
yes.
carrier pigeons to talk to your friends, and then pretend your lights are off at night so nobody comes asking you for something.
Exactly.
That's amazing. And so, how are you working now to spread more solar with like maybe you can talk more about I think it's APT and how that's working, because I know there's a lot of, so as my day job I'm a business broker, and I've been speaking to one company who's acquiring another company, and they're working in these advanced materials and they're trying to build new wind turbines, and they see that that's where everyone's going. And not to mention, because it seems like the last 5 years, and correct me if I'm wrong, wind and solar has just increased so dramatically what its theoretical limit is, and it's producing so much more energy that if we start populating our cities and our suburbs with these things, we really can achieve energy independence in 20 years. Is that accurate?
Yeah, yes, certainly the rate at which things are moving. I don't see a world anytime soon where we're only running on renewable energy,
Yeah.
because in some ways you need those other power stations to make sure that you always have power. Like if you look at my background in Michigan, we don't get much
Right.
sunshine. Today is a rainy day, but in general, we need to make sure that, if the wind is not blowing and the sun is not shining, that we still have some sort of power.
Right. So
Otherwise,
in those areas, you
um,
need either nuclear fission, or is it fusion that the ITER project, the ITER project in France, is that fusion?
that's
Right.
fusion.
Yeah. So I
Yes,
that seems like what they say. It's always 30 years in the future. But I guess for us to achieve true energy independence, we need something like that doesn't create a waste problem that becomes almost as serious as the energy problem.
correct. And it's self-sustaining too.
Right.
So that's really one of the benefits. And as I mentioned earlier, the sun is a nuclear fusion, the best we
Yeah.
know, and so many other stars. But you just need a very high temperature for a very short period of time to get that process started. And that's the challenge that scientists and engineers are working on right now, is simply keeping the material hot long enough for it to start becoming self-sustainable, to generate more power than it
Right.
uses.
And maybe talk a little bit about. So I have a friend did a PhD in photovoltaic energy, and so we'd have these conversations because I'm obviously super curious about this field. And I remember she used to say that the theoretical limit was 30% for what the sun would shine on a solar panel. We could capture 30% of that to be used. I know storage is a totally different topic, but how has the theoretical limit for what we can capture from solar changed in the last 10 years?
Yeah. So let me quickly tell you first about APT and
Please.
my relation to all of the renewable energy, because it has nothing to do with my space
Okay.
sciences background. So when I was a grad student, sometimes in my home basement, I would just tinker with things, because I had been working on a project back in college where we put solar panels on colleges' golf carts.
Why not?
Because that's what you do
Yeah,
as a
that's amazing.
other grad student. And then I simply came up with the question of, is there any way we can make a solar panel generate more electricity in a very small footprint, so that you don't have to have a giant panel everywhere you go? And that's really the project that I started on my own. Was then the idea of shrinking solar panels into a very small footprint, which meant that instead of a giant panel, what I did was I stacked solar cells, which a solar panel is comprising of many solar cells next to each
Okay.
other and wired together. So instead of putting them on a plane, I put them on top of each other in a three-dimensional configuration inside of a tube. And that's how I generated a lot more power in very small footprint than a typical flat
You
panel.
were the first one to do that?
I was the first one to do that,
That's
and
a,
that's
that's
why.
that's amazing. I mean, I saw a YouTube video not too long ago where I saw they're starting to stand up panels.
Yeah.
Where I don't think it's exactly what you said, but they're standing up and they're finding that they're getting more efficacy. And there's something else where it seems like they were built in a configuration where there's mirrors, which also generates more. Are these
Mhm.
are these all different ways depending on the landscape that you have to do, or is the one that you did
Yeah.
kind of like going to be what's rolled out moving forward?
Yeah. So the idea of three-dimensional solar modules has been out for a long time. So there are certain challenges that you have to deal with, and I don't want to get into the weeds because I know that your question was about the bigger um, topic of efficiency. So in general, what you deal with if you make so it's a solar panel that takes a lot of space. If you make it vertical, now it's a solar sail.
Okay.
That means that the wind is just going to constantly you have to deal with the wind,
Okay.
right? And if it's flat, then you have dust and snow, and bird
Right.
stuff
Sure.
that is going to
Yeah.
build up. And just like Christmas lights, when I told you about the little solar cells that are inside the
Yeah.
panel, if one solar cell goes out, it's just like one Christmas light going out of the entire
Oh.
string, the entire panel
Okay.
is down. Or if one cell is covered and the rest of the panel is fine, the overall power drops because of
Right.
that, the way they're structured. So the way we have dealt with this is that instead of having to fight the wind, our three-dimensional solar module is inside of a transparent window that allows us to simply, so the wind goes around us instead of having to constantly fight the wind.
Okay.
Okay. And when it comes to actively tracking the sun, so you have to turn this giant solar panel to track the sun and fight the wind constantly. And that's when it comes to tracking, it's only very large projects that use tracking. You never see a tracker on someone's house,
Right. Well, yeah,
right?
because that becomes
Because
you're using more power to track the sun, so probably the energy you're using is consuming the benefit you're going to get from tracking.
correct. And also it's very expensive because you have to make it very strong to fight the
Right.
wind, especially on rooftops. Whereas in our case, our cells do not interfere with the wind, or the wind is not
Hmm.
impacting them. And therefore, when it comes to tracking, our individual solar cells are going to very inside track the sun very comfortably, and generate a lot more power. So one of the things about the efficiency of these solar cells now is that the solar movement started just like hydrogen or clean energy in the 90s, and there was this renewable energy bubble where we were not quite ready for a transition into renewable energy. So the market invested in it and then it didn't go
Right.
anywhere. And that's why, if you look at the stock market for some of these renewable energy companies, like hydrogen companies, you see that in the 90s, their share had gone so high up.
And then a super crash.
Yeah. However, this time, because so much investment has gone into not only improving the chemistry of the cells, but also improving the manufacturability and financeability of the
Right.
cells and wind and everything else. So now both business and science are working hand in hand to make solar or renewable energy in general more competitive, because both the economics works, but also science is helping with the economics working.
Okay.
So over the past decade, for the first time, because both the efficiency of the cells but also the reliability and the slash business aspect of solar panels have become so great, that for the first time solar panels or solar electricity has overcome coal electricity,
Wow.
which has been subsidized for a long time, at least in the
Right.
US. I don't know about the rest of the world. And that shows that all of the investment in both science, but also in making sure that the manufacturing is easy, that they're replaceable, that the banks think that it's a safe investment,
Right.
and everything else has worked out. And one of the benefits of that is that now power generators or power plants are not so far from the cities. When you're driving along highway, you see solar farms everywhere, you see wind turbines along
Sure.
the road, and that's simply, the whole idea was to decentralize power
Right.
generation. And that's how you can bring power generation closer to the user, so so much of the electricity is not wasted along the line.
Oh, right.
But
Because
also,
just
you
transport, you're going to lose a lot of energy potency.
yes,
So if you have a new updated solar cell now with a good transport capability, how much of the sun's power can you actually keep uh, every day?
yeah. So there are solar cells that in lab conditions, if you put it under vacuum and
Right, in a perfect world.
do really great, you can reach up to, there are numbers of up to 50%
Right.
sometimes, or even higher. But typically, what you find in the market today for commercial solar panels is around 22 to 28%
Okay.
of, on a good day, if you have the sun perfectly vertical and you know it's not a hot day or anything like that, that around 25% is of the energy is being converted to electricity.
Okay. So it's pretty close to what that. So I'm sure even 20 years ago, they wouldn't have thought by 2024 that like a home solar panel would have reached 25%. Like, would they would have thought it
Correct.
was crazy even 20 years ago, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So early solar panels were actually just copper
Right.
plates, because there's the photoelectric effect where when you shine light onto a piece of metal, the electrons get released, and then you collect the electrons and can charge a battery with it. Over time, that's when we started to really invest in semiconductors,
Right.
because we started to realize that, oh, they have these properties that we didn't know about, that we can constantly tweak, because when it comes to semiconductors, there are multiple layers of materials, silicon and some other, you use different silicons with different doping, we
Right.
call it. Simply what you add to the material, and simply it's the dopant that lets the layer to be positive or negative. And that's how you can stack many of these up on top of each other to allow you to direct electricity in the ways that you
Right.
want.
And how
Yeah.
is APT helping the push towards solar?
Yeah. So really, the way we are going after this is that instead of covering fields and fields and fields with solar panels, APT's mission is to bring what we call solar forest to the market.
Okay.
So a solar farm is where you cover the entire field with solar panels. Whereas instead of a panel, now we have towers, because this footprint is very small. So you can go to very populated areas and bring solar electricity to those
Right.
neighborhoods. So instead of putting it on a field, we go along highways. We have these towers that are installed, that generate electricity on existing, unutilized urban landscape. And by doing that, solar forests can go where solar farms or solar panels cannot go. And that's simply what you're trying to do, is to make it even easier for the users to get access to solar electricity.
Right.
Because if you don't have a rooftop, if if you live in a urban area and you don't have access to a field to deploy solar farm or anything, we're making it possible through new solar products like solar lights, solar cameras, solar, smart city applications, but also solar towers and eventually solar
Hmm.
forests, to make electricity exactly where you're going to use it, so that there is barely any um, you know transmission required between the generation and the
Well,
user.
so where would someone, let's say residential, where would someone put a solar? Because right now, all you see is like these large solar panels on people's homes that are like, if you
Mhm.
happen to have a gigantic house, then you can put it on your roof and maybe generate something to offset your
Mhm.
otherwise utility costs. Where could you now put like a solar tower and yeah,
Mhm.
where could you put a solar tower in a home?
Yeah. So there are various ways of thinking about that. One is simply these towers that are a little wider, to be able to generate more
Yeah.
electricity for residential property. Other aspects is that you have right now, you have a fence around your house. You could make that fence solar. because you could have these 6 foot tall towers, all connected next to each other to generate electricity and bring it back to the
There's already
house.
I can already see neighbors
So
murdering each other over these fences. Everybody likes a fight over a fence in these residential neighborhoods. But I guess even with that said, I guess if you shared quite a long border with your neighbor and you agreed to have them installed with your neighbor, you could somehow share the power generation, I would imagine.
good. Yeah, that's definitely something
Right.
that those are the logistics of the electricity itself. But yes, that's definitely, so every individual tower could be wired separately, or that they can all be linked together to bring power to a power um,
And how big are they?
panel.
Are they durable enough that like you could have it in a backyard and you have kids and family playing around and these things are like
Yes.
there's no danger for any sort of emitting rays or anything that comes off these electricities? I have no idea.
Yeah. Yeah. So actually, our product that was just piloted all throughout the state of Michigan, in both the Upper Peninsula and Lower Peninsula, in parks and remote areas, is a solar light, which is, instead of having if you've seen solar street lights, it's a giant street light with a giant solar panel
Yep,
on
I've
top.
seen those.
So what we've done, in order to generate that type of brightness of a few thousand lumens, you need a giant panel to be able to operate. Whereas what we've done instead is that, because our footprint is only 3 inches in diameter,
Wow.
we have solar cells stacked on top of each other for around 2 feet, and that generates 12 times more power than just having one little cell on the top of the light, which is what you find normally in the market, is one little solar cell, two batteries, and two
Right.
LEDs. If you've seen these driveway lights, solar lights, that you just buy a bucket
Sure.
dozen and install it, and you have to replace them the
Yeah.
following year. So what we've done is that we've stacked these on top of each other, generate 12 times more power. We have a lot more storage for the
Hmm.
electricity, and because of that, instead of two little LEDs generating 2 lumens, we generate 2,000 lumens,
Wow.
because we generate so much
Wow.
electricity. So for the first time, we have a unit around 3 foot tall that generates the amount of light that many parks that don't have access to electricity along the pathway are using, and it reduces their installation and project costs by 80%, because they don't have to bring electricity to every site where
Oh,
they
right,
want
because
light.
you need to build underground delivery mechanism to give you that
Exactly.
electricity. And so, how many of these towers would one need in like I don't know, just a regular townhouse or home? How many
Mhm.
towers would you theoretically need to sufficiently power that house for a year?
Yeah. So let me put it in analogous terms. So a typical Target store in the
Yeah.
U.S., or any other grocery store, typical grocery store, generates around, if I remember correctly, around 10 megawatt hours per year.
Okay. And you mean like
And
do you mean like a small convenience store, or do you mean like a large grocery store, like a okay,
large
okay,
grocery store. And so now, in order to generate that much electricity, you can either cover a football field with solar
yeah,
panels, or that you can mount solar towers around the field, 1 yard apart, or every 1 meter,
right,
to have these towers that go around the football field to generate the same amount of power.
amazing, right.
Okay, so it's your choice. That, do you have the land to cover it with solar panels, or would you like to use the land and instead have a fence around it with solar towers to generate the same amount of
Right. In a large
electricity?
grocery store, I would imagine would use a lot more electricity than your standard residential homes.
Absolutely.
Not to mention people are out during the day,
Yes.
or maybe there's only one or two at night, only running a TV and a video game center or something like that. So
Correct.
if the analogy is similar, then you're saying that if would it be feasible to fill a backyard with like 20 of these towers and be able to have enough electricity?
Yes. So the towers need to be a little taller than six
Yeah.
foot tall, but you can go around your property with this solar, what we call solar fence or solar
Yeah.
forest, and generate enough electricity to
And
power
how
your
much
house.
are one of
We're
those
not there
towers?
yet, but that's definitely something that we're working on.
Right. And how much are one of those towers?
So right now, the type of financing that we're working on is simply for the lights. We're still at the very early stage of the whole
Sure.
process. APT is a brand new company, and we're a very small company but big
Yeah.
dreams. So the idea is that eventually, with the amount of electricity that we generate, with the tracking, we're able to reduce the overall cost of a project, of a solar electricity project, because we generate more electricity in small
Right.
footprints. So right now, the estimates are that solar electricity, depending on your location in the country, I don't know about the world, but in the U.S., depending on your location, solar electricity is cheaper than fossil fuel
Amazing.
electricity sometimes, and that means that let's say 20 cents per kilowatt hour. Our goal is to beat that.
Yeah.
Okay, and we can do that because our large projects do not have to deal with so much of the what we call soft
Hmm.
costs associated with solar farms. So we don't have to worry about connecting it to the grid because you need a permit for that. We don't have to worry about purchasing land because we don't need land.
Right.
Those are soft costs that you don't normally think about when you think about a energy
Right.
project.
So I
But it's not
I
just the
think I think
hardware.
most people understand that any new technology, once it comes out, just like when we got these gigantic plasma TVs which no longer exist, of how much they're 5,000 a TV, and now you can't find one. If you wanted, you could buy it for $30. And so
Exactly.
do you feel comfortable sharing how much one of these towers cost now, and then maybe we can project a little bit where it will be in 5, 10 years? Or is it
Yeah.
crazy? It's like
So
$100,000 for a tower.
no, it's they're definitely affordable right now. So when you have pilots ongoing, the cost of a pilot compared to the final cost of manufacturing is significantly
Right.
different, right? Because the scale manufacturing is really what changes the
Hmm.
game. So right now, our lights, we're only looking at luxury lighting, luxury landscape lighting for our first products because we need early adopters who think that the lights are aesthetically pleasing, but also generate the type of power that you need and brightness
Right.
that you need for your application. So we have cities that are purchasing these lights for their
Amazing.
pathways. Yeah,
Congrats.
and we have, and again, thank you. That's because if they were to do the same amount of light for the same project using typical grid connected lights, their projects would be 80% more
Right.
expensive. Okay, so they're doing a lot of cost saving. In some ways, um, simply just bringing people to design the land is more expensive than our lights,
What a
right?
selling what
So
what a
that's
what a selling line. Yeah.
yeah. So that's really how we're looking at this. And so the cost in the long run for one panel and one tower is going to be very similar.
Right. Okay.
Okay, so that's, and but we can't get there unless we have explored these early markets to make sure that we can scale manufacturing to compete with existing products.
Gotcha. Well, amazing. I want to be respectful of your time. I know you have another appointment. Yeah, if when you guys are ever ready to expand to Europe, let me know. And if there's any way that I can help, either be an investor, find investors, or help with BD, I'm happy to be part of the solution on this. So
I appreciate you so very much. And yeah, for your listeners and viewers, check out aptss.com. That's the website
aptss.com.
for the
You
company.
can witness the future
Yes,
happening. Thank you,
exactly.
man. I appreciate your time.
Thank you so very much for your time and hope that everyone learned something. I definitely enjoyed the
Likewise.
conversation. Thank you. Bye.
So thanks for listening to No More, No Less. I appreciate the time you spent with me today. So please subscribe and rate the show if you enjoyed it. It'll help me create more amazing content and get that next little bit of validation that I so deeply crave. If you didn't enjoy it, well, that sucks. But to make sure, I think you should listen to my next 10 episodes and then decide. I mean, come on. Rome was not built in a day. I'm just getting warmed up here, guys. So thanks again. See you next time.